Margaret Atwood joined the Velshi Band Book Club to talk about her seminal dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale. She reminded us that she got all the ideas for the book set in a near-future autocratic theocracy from actual history, from real things that had happened in the world and could happen again. She actually kept the newspaper clippings that she used as research when she wrote this book in 1985. And this week, there's a story out of the state of Ohio that reads like a building block of Gilead come to life. Ohio Republicans introduced a bill that would allow the government to track every pregnancy from beginning to end. The measure, called House Bill 754, HB 754, would create a state-run registry of pregnancies, requiring medical providers to file a certificate of life within the Ohio Department of Health within 10 days of examining a pregnant patient and detecting a fetal heartbeat. It's worth noting here that what we call a fetal heartbeat is more accurately described as fetal heart activity, which the Cleveland Clinic notes begins as the cells that will later form the fetal heart begin to cluster early in the first trimester and can create electrical pulses. The medical provider would be required to provide a copy of that certificate of life to the pregnant woman. The bill also mandates that fetal deaths be registered with the state and that providers specify whether a pregnancy ended in miscarriage, abortion, or stillbirth. I'm not done. Then a cause of death would need to be certified within 48 hours. And if a fetus is deemed to have died in a, quote, violent, suspicious, unusual, or sudden, end quote, manner, a coroner or a medical examiner would be brought in. So who decides which fetal deaths, which are otherwise known as miscarriages, which are also very common, should be deemed suspicious? And for that matter, a miscarriage is medically defined as a sudden or spontaneous loss of a fetus. It is always sudden. That's literally what a miscarriage is. According to the Mayo Clinic, about 10 to 20% of known pregnancies result in a sudden loss of a fetus, a miscarriage. The actual number is likely much higher because many miscarriages happen very early in a pregnancy, in some cases before a woman realizes that they are pregnant. As the journalist Jessica Valenti writes, quote, let's be clear about what this really is. An attempt to build an infrastructure for pregnancy surveillance, not just tracking who's pregnant, but documenting how every pregnancy ends and creating a pathway for scrutiny if the state decides that something looks off. While this legislation would be insane, no matter where it was introduced, the fact that it's being proposed in a state like Ohio, where in 2023, voters passed an amendment enshrining the right to abortion in the state's constitution, is telling. The state already requires a death certificate for miscarriages past 20 weeks of gestation. So while this bill, if it's signed into law, would certainly face legal challenges, it's not entirely clear whether it would be overturned in a post-Roe legal climate. And regardless of whether or not legislation like HB 754 passes, it's a terrifying signal of intent. It tells us exactly what kind of regime conservative lawmakers are trying to implement. It lays bare the purpose of the anti-abortion movement, which has always been about controlling women and their bodies. And it heralds a sort of reproductive police state that sounds a lot like Chapter 11 of The Handmaid's Tale. Quote, yesterday morning I went to the doctor, was taken by a guardian, one of those with the red armbands who are in charge of such things. We rode in a red car, him in front, me in the back. No twin went with me. On these occasions, I'm solitaire. I'm taken to the doctor's office once a month for tests, urine, hormones, cancer smear, blood tests, the same as before, except that now it's obligatory. Joining me now is Michelle Goodwin, professor of constitutional law and global health policy at Georgetown Law. She's the host of the On the Issues podcast. She's the author of the very important book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. Michelle, thank you for being here. I love having you on the show, and we've talked about this so many years, but I was sort of mixed about having you on the show because I thought you may be too heavy a hitter for this, given your expertise, because this is just basic weird. Policing of women. There's no science or medicine to discuss here.
Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you for being so consistent and shining in a very important light about what's happening in our country with regard to women and reproductive health, rights, and justice. And you're right, it's absurd. It reminds me of a speech that Dr. King wrote upon receiving a Humanitarian of the Year award from Planned Parenthood in 1966. And he began that speech with saying, if aliens were to drop down from outer space, they would say that our nation is governed by a group of insane men. Well, in this case, we see the majority of these legislatures as being male controlled, though the author of this bill happens to be a woman in the state of Ohio, and it is absolutely insane. And what it purports is exactly what you suggested is surveillance and the potential, the very real potential and probability of criminal punishments and civil fines and various other horrors.
So miscarriages are very, very, very common. I mean, part of the whole discussion you and I have been having for years is if men knew a little bit more about reproductive stuff, some of this stuff wouldn't happen, right? And if you tried this on men, right, if you suggested there was anything that that men do that should be surveilled, people would burn everything down. Remember all the stress about whether you should be on a contact list if you had COVID, and how great. Can you imagine this degree of tracking women? In many cases, in a traumatic period for them. If they have lost a child and now you got 48 hours, you got to file documents and you got to do all this stuff. It's really just basic policing. To what end?
Oh, yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, what we see right now are proxies, and you've been talking about this, and we've talked about this, the connection between democracy and reproductive health, rights, and justice. So right now, we have the potentiality that many women, like millions potentially, could lose their right to vote if the SAVE Act gets across the line. We see actions like this, which are meant, this is all a part of a flood the zone that is targeted at women. And what we know with this is that when the Supreme Court overturned Dobbs in when the Supreme Court overturned Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 2022 with its Dobbs decision, our Supreme Court only years before had acknowledged that a woman is 14 times more likely to die in this country by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. Full stop. 2016, the Supreme Court acknowledged that in a Texas abortion case. We also know, as you've mentioned, that miscarriages are frequent. They are a part of life of a woman. They're part of pregnancies. Upwards of 30% of pregnancies will end in miscarriage. That's a reality, and also stillbirth. But what you see with this pronatalism, this anti-abortionism, is this surveillance, this tracking, this desire to criminally punish, to civilly punish. What this has meant is that doctors have had a very hard time intervening when they otherwise would have across this country because they
to save a woman's life, right? Because something may have to happen, but that might mean the result is an abortion, and now the doctor or the hospital doesn't want to get involved in that.
Oh, no, they don't, because, you risk 99 years incarceration and a $100,000 fine for each patient that you provide ethical professional care towards. I mean, this is the lunacy that's been unleashed by the Supreme Court with its Dobbs decision, and notably the Venn diagrams that overlap between the anti-abortion states and the American Confederacy. I mean, we're talking about states that have had a very strong taste for the subordination of groups of people, including women and including people of color, particularly Black women. And you notice then those who've become most harmed by this, all women are harmed, but there's a specific kind of terror that is unleashed in the lives of low-income women and women of color, and particularly Black women. And it's a real tragedy that isn't being spoken to in as explicit terms as needed.
A taste for subjugating groups of people. Note to myself, when in doubt, asking Michelle Goodwin to come on the show is always a good idea. Thank you for being with us, as always. Professor Michelle Goodwin, she's a professor at Georgetown Law, host of the On the Issues podcast, and author of the increasingly relevant and important book, Policing the Womb. All right, coming